Same repetition technique, but in 16th notes. Whether you're playing fast or slow, make sure your hands and wrists are very relaxed. When you're rotating your fingers, it's natural for your hand to go left and right a little bit. If I put my hands naturally on piano like this to play fourth finger on C, my hand comes to this position. But if I try to play third finger, it comes to this position. And second finger's right here, and first finger's right here. See how it moved from here to here. If your hands and wrists are relaxed, your hands should go wherever the finger commands to, like this. But if you're tense, your fingers have to fight your hands to play these notes, and that's not going to go well. Also, be careful not to push down your hand like this, because your fingers has to be able to relax and come back up. If your hand position is too low, then it takes a little bit more effort for your fingers to come up. As a result, the previous finger doesn't come up quickly enough so that the next finger can play the key. Group 3, number 5 introduces you to chromatic scale, but only from C to E.
Нет, наоборот, это нет. Наоборот.
When you play chromatic scales, you use number 1 finger on white keys and number 3 fingers on black keys. And because you're going to curve your fingers and you use your fingertip, it literally looks like you are walking on the keys like this. Make sure you're not flattening your third finger like this, or using your thumb on the side like this. Then you're going to end up playing like this. Well, I didn't expect myself to be able to make it to the end. But with this technique, I won't be able to play smoothly, faster, or in a longer succession. Speaking of chromatic scales, group 5, number 4 is also chromatic scale. But this time, you're going to have to go from C to C, a full octave. The basic fingering rules still same. Number 1 on white keys and number 3 on black keys. But whenever you hit these spots where you don't have black keys in between two white keys, then you will have to use number 2 to supplement it. For your right hand, it goes like this. Now you don't have the black key here, so you're going to have to use number 2. So you can go back to 3-1, 3-1, 3-1 pattern. And another part where you don't have the black keys, you're going to use 2. But when you go down, though, you're going to have to use number 2 finger first, like this. And 1, 3, 1, 3. Now right here, if you use number 1 first, and number 2, and number 3, you're going to end up in twisting your hand like this. So instead, what you have to do is, now when you hit the spot where you don't have a black key between the white keys, you're going to have to use number 2 finger first. Now you're back to normal routine of 1, 3, 1, 3. And this happens when you're going up with your left hand. Now here, If you use number 1 first and then supplement by using number 2.
Ну, надо что-то посмотреть, что там. Ничего не надо смотреть. Нет. Нет.
Здравствуйте, в эфире новости Удмуртии, в студии Марины Симоновой. Смотрите в этом выпуске. В столице республики открыли новый пункт вакцинации, где теперь ставят прививки и в будни, и в выходные. Санобработка 4 раза за день. Транспортники показали, как работают в условиях ухудшения эпидситуации. Платить за тепло Ижевск будет по факту. Правительство согласилось с предложением Гордумы, когда горожане перейдут на новый способ оплаты. И больше, чем спорт, в Удмуртии прошел первый республиканский чемпионат танцев на колясках.
Может, была лайка, видишь? Гусли. Да, хорошо. Что тут есть нормально? Да. Я здесь стою.
Коллеги, привет! Мы компания TS Solution, и более 10 лет мы работаем с нашими клиентами по решению вопросов и задач по информационной безопасности. Мы прекрасно понимаем, что одним из базовых решений по обеспечению безопасности вашей компании является система UTM-класса. Поэтому мы создали курс «Континент 4 Get Started» совместно с нашим партнером компанией Код Безопасность. Пройдя данный курс, вы научитесь проводить базовые настройки первой UTM-системы с поддержкой алгоритма шифрования ГОСТ. Изучите систему на берегу и сможете задать все необходимые базовые и неудобные вопросы нашим инженерам. Курс доступен на платформе TS Solution University в формате 24/7 и состоит из 7 уроков, абсолютно бесплатно и без всякого подвоха. В рамках курса вы сможете развернуть виртуальную машину и изучить варианты внедрения, базовый функционал, лицензирование и сертификацию самого решения. изучить компоненты, межсетевой экран, SSL-инспекцию, IPS-IDS, настройку VPN и остальные важные базовые аспекты для корректной работы системы. Пройдите успешно тест и получите сертификат о прохождении данного курса и о владении базовыми знаниями по настройке системы Continent 4 от компании TS Solution. Регистрируйтесь по ссылке ниже. Оставайтесь с нами на наших Telegram и YouTube каналах, а также на нашем портале TS Solution University. Увидимся там.
Why is the orchestra the way it is? Why are some instruments in and some instruments out? Where are the electric guitars, synthesizers, saxophones, accordions? Why are there so many violins? And who pays for it all? And why has the lineup not changed for 100 years? Has it reached some state of perfection or just a dead end? In short, tell me the history of the orchestra, more or less. Back in the day, no one had orchestras, they couldn't afford them. Musicians were expensive, and only the church had that kind of brass, and they mostly preferred a sing-song. The largest instrumental groups were consorts, 3 to 5 players, usually accompanying a singer. Then various kings and aristocrats, guys with lots of castles and cash, thought, we want to make a big splash. We want to show the world that we're really grand. And what better way to do that than get a really big band? But what kind of a band? Let's ask some composers, they'll have an idea. Here's one, Claudio Monteverdi. He lived in Venice around 1600, and he says, I have an idea, told you, I'd like to write an opera. Orfeo, you know, the guy who goes to the underworld, sings to get his dead wife back, then forgets not to turn around. Sounds great. Well, I'll let you choose the instruments. So Monteverdi picked a Noah's Ark lineup of 2 cornets, 2 theorbos, 2 basses, 2 harpsichords, 2 organs, a harp, 2 piccolo violins, 3 bass violins, an organ, a flute, clarinet, 4 trombones, and 10 viola di braccio. Viola da Wazzo? Ah, yes. Let me explain, because this thing's really important to our story. Once upon a time, there were 2 families, the viols and the violins. One quiet, soulful, and with a touch of sadness in his voice, and the other with a beautiful, loud voice that he wasn't afraid to show off. The head of the viol family was the viola da gamba, the leg viola. He was great to listen to in your living room, but put him in a larger hall and you could hardly hear him speak. One day along came his distant cousin, the viola da braccio, or viola da braccio as Monteverdi called it. It means arm viola, but it's actually a violin, a whole new kind of instrument. And this guy was confident and loud, much better at playing to the crowd. Orfeo was one of the first pieces to include the violin, but over the next 200 years, viols were turfed out of the land of music and usurped by this young upstart. They take over and fill the land with their larger progeny, the viola, the cello, and eventually the double bass. Although he's a bit of a mongrel, we'll save that story for another time.
Who are you calling a mongrel?
And with his conquest complete, the violin was set to take his place at the heart of the orchestra, while the viol headed off into the sunset. So can we call Monteverdi's band Orchestra version 1.0 the first official orchestra? Most people would say no, and to see why, we need to check the feature list. Okay, so Monteverdi has 2 of these, a large number of players and a whole mess of strings. But what about the all playing together feature? No, we don't have that. In Orfeo, the players never really play all together. The instruments keep to their own distinct little groups. And what about multi-string alchemy? This is something Monteverdi definitely hadn't discovered, and it's one of the key features of Orchestra 1.0. Take any instrumental line and add another instrument playing in unison. In most cases, the sound gets a little bit louder, but no big deal. But it turns out that with strings, and the new violin family in particular, that once you add 3 or more instruments all playing the same line, a totally different quality emerges. A multi-stringed alchemy where the sound becomes rich, velvety, opulent. You might say it was a sound fit for a king. This is Louis, and this is Lully, composer Jean-Baptiste Lully. And this is Les 24 Violons du Roi, the 24 Violins of the King, one of the first multi-string groups that resembles a modern orchestra. Hearing this unique orchestral string sound for the very first time must have made quite an impression, and there are delightful tales from the time of the group curing a depressed wife of her melancholy, so powerful was the impact. Everyone was so happy with the new group that a few years later, Louis, who was now this Louis, told Lully that he had some spare lolly. Go and get some winds as well, flutes, oboes and bassoons. Get those new ones. Let's stick them all together with the strings in a great big blender and they can play at my opera, says Louis. Maybe add a trumpet from time to time. Occasional trumpets, copy, says Louis. And make them all start together. We'll call that the premier coup d'archet, the first stroke of the bow. We'll be famous for it. Great, said Lully, and if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to stand here at the front and bang my big stick on the ground to keep time, like this. Ow! Ouch, I just banged it too hard and hit my foot. Now I've got gangrene. Now I'm dead. But despite being dead, you can see this whole orchestra thing is a great idea. Everyone will love it. And everyone did. German courts and English royals all said, we'll have one of those, please. So lots of orchestras started sprouting up, but all different shapes and sizes. So who's got the biggest orchestra? I don't know, maybe Corelli in Rome. He sometimes gets like 100, but only on special occasions. Besides, size isn't everything. Bach over in Germany only has about 18. Barely an orchestra at all, but man does he have the best tunes. Championed by composers like over in Germany only has about 18. Barely an orchestra at all, but man does he have the best tunes. Championed by composers like Vivaldi, the first concertos were written. The irresistible drama of pitting a soloist against an entire orchestra meant the form became incredibly popular and remains so to this day. But after a while, everyone got a bad case of FOMO. Oh look, they've got horns in Stuttgart, we need to get some horns. Why is theirs different to ours? They've ditched their recorders, they've ditched their keyboards. Let's ditch ours too. Most towns had spare trumpeters and kettle drum players kicking around who played in military bands, so they were often used. One of the most notable losses was the old rhythm section of the band, the continuo, who'd become impossible to hear in the larger ensembles. But without them, the band still needed a way to keep time, and the job fell to the first violinist or concertmaster, who beat time with a rolled-up sheet of music or with the violin bow. So the orchestra settled into a standardized ensemble, strings plus pairs of flutes, oboes, bassoons, trumpets, horns, and sometimes timpani. Good for composers because they could start figuring out the best strategies of writing for such a large group, knowing that a piece written for here would work just as well over there. But even as the orchestra's shape crystallized, it was still open to change and adaptation. A new instrument came along called the clarinet. It was unusual because it didn't have any associations. In the old days, a flute meant love, or a shepherd, or both. A trumpet meant glory, and a horn meant it's time to go hunting. But the clarinet didn't have any role like that, so it was kind of an abstract instrument. Composers loved it and added it into the orchestra. In fact, abstract music was all the rage. Music was no longer just setting the scene for an opera. It was all about showing off the skill and magnificence of the orchestra. Some of the biggest show-offs were the Mannheim Orchestra. They showed off their brilliant woodwind soloists who no longer just shadowed the strings but had their own independent lines. And they just loved tricks and gave them all names. The Mannheim Rocket, the Mannheim Roller, the Mannheim Sigh, and most famously the Mannheim Crescendo. But despite bribing the judges and having the best players, the composers at Mannheim didn't win Eurovision. The judges of history gave them roughly 0 points. They gave 12 points to these two, Haydn and Mozart. Then roughly, the judges and having the best players, the composers at Mannheim didn't win Eurovision. The judges of history gave them roughly 0 points. They gave 12 points to these two, Haydn and Mozart. I don't know about you, but I just love this new abstract musical form called a symphony, said Haydn. I'm going to write 104 of them. Yeah, symphonies are great, said Mozart. Between us, we'll use the orchestra to show how balance and proportion can create a world of sound that has the elegance and simplicity of a Greek temple. Sure, says Beethoven, but I want to do more. I've got bigger lapels and bigger ideas. We need more of everything. I want the winds to go higher and lower. So give me a piccolo at the top and a contrabassoon at the bottom. We also need 3 horns. 4 horns, so I can make full horn chords. I want it louder. Give me trombones. Give me more timpani. And I want to write 4 notes that will capture the essence of orchestral music for eternity. And I want you to put that on a t-shirt and sell it. Links in the description. And finally, in the name of music, I want you to show David some love by supporting him on Patreon. Beethoven's 9 symphonies set a new standard for power and drama, kick-starting the Romantic era of personal expression. Where orchestras had once been a plaything of the wealthy, they now became vehicles for expressing the inner emotional drama of man. Me! And yes, it was largely a boys-only club. Opportunities for female composers were few and far between in a world where even the orchestra itself was men only, right up until the 20th century. It must have been a pretty deflating experience. But it was a sunny period for male composers who quickly adopted Beethoven's
видео можно запихать то, что, семестр специализированной музыкальной литературы там и чего, да, я понял просто. Да, то, что раньше так было, по крайней мере, да. Ну да, но это не важно, да, понятно. Нет, теперь им надо что-то другое, теперь им надо, да, понимаешь. Выделять, что важно, там, бла-бла-бла. Да, короче, это не, ну и чё, да, понимаете, вот, да. Да. Нет, это было все, да, двигатель, да.
Orchestra, along with his spirit of innovation. The role of the conductor itself began with composers like Weber and Mendelssohn standing on the podium in front of the orchestra conducting their own work. Berlioz experimented with new instruments, writing challenging parts for the harp that he had trouble finding performers capable of playing. He also used valve trumpets in the orchestra for the first time, meaning they could be put to a much more melodic use from now on, and horns soon got the message and followed suit. The only thing missing now from the brass section was a reliable bass. Several instruments battled it out until the tuba eventually secured the spot. The next man in town, Richard Wagner, had megalomaniacier tendencies than Beethoven. He wrote operas where he literally destroyed the gods, and he continued the bigger is better school of orchestral thought. He even invented entire new instruments like his own version of the bass trumpet and a lower version of the French horn, confusingly known as the Wagner tuba. The orchestra under Wagner expanded to triple woodwinds and a much larger string section with more complex subdivided parts. So what fueled all this growth, and how was it paid for? Well, the expansion had taken place against the backdrop of the Industrial Revolution, where the old aristocratic courts were in decline and the size of cities was growing exponentially. Orchestras started playing more for the great unwashed general public and not just for the toffs in the court. They still needed the toffs to help pay the bills, but now anyone with a few quid could get in and hear an orchestra. It became a very popular pastime, and as the audience grew, so new halls were needed to accommodate them, and then bigger orchestras to fill those bigger halls with sound. Having an orchestra and a hall became a point of pride for many cities, and the halls were often funded by rich patrons who wanted to join the immortals by seeing their name above the door.
That's me.
New composing gods like Strauss and Stravinsky continued to explore new musical territories and build fantastical new orchestral creatures. If there was a frisson of scandal and outrage about their work, it was just the shock of the new and a sign that people still cared. But alongside the composing gods, there was a new immortal in town in the form of the conductor, who, for the watching audience, embodied the powerful sounds and experiences of the orchestra. In the new age of radio and television, conductors like Toscanini became genuine celebrities. They lapped up the attention, but they also noticed that the audience saved their loudest cheers for the familiar tunes by the old masters. So ever so quietly, the conductors started ditching the newer composers with their strange, unfamiliar sounds and just playing the older stuff. None of the composing gods noticed the problem at first, and some would blame them for exploring too far from home and returning back speaking in strange extraterrestrial languages. But either way, when they returned from their travels, they found their godly powers had vanished and they were shut out in the cold. Shivering alongside them were many of the iconic instrumental inventions of the past 100 years, from electric guitars to saxophones, from accordions to synthesizers. If they weren't needed for Beethoven or Tchaikovsky, they might be allowed in for a token performance here and there, but they stood no chance of a permanent position. And see my videos on the sax and the accordion for more on why that was such a shame. By keeping out the composers and the new instruments they brought with them, the orchestra was shutting out the creative life force that had driven it for so long. So inside its closed-off castle, it stopped evolving and slowly started turning to stone. Faced with a set lineup and limited orchestral opportunities, what could composers do? They had no choice but to get resourceful, and one of the best untapped resources they realized they had in the orchestra was the percussion section. The orchestra typically has 4 or 5 players who, in most classical and romantic symphonies, played little more than a handful of notes. Composers realized they could get these players to play all manner of exotic percussion instruments from around the world without requiring a change to the orchestral lineup. The other approach they took was to pare back the excesses of the Romantic era and write for far smaller orchestras. New smaller scale chamber ensembles emerged, often run by composers themselves, and often a kind of mini orchestra with one of each kind of instrument, and this was where many of the 20th century's most creative adventures continued. So was that the end for the orchestra? Does a lineup started under Louis XIV still have anything relevant to say today? Or is it now just a historical tourist attraction churning out the same old hits day after day? Many within the orchestra want more than that. The difficulty orchestras face is that they're now large institutions funded either by governments or by wealthy subscribers and patrons who are resistant to change. And the very buildings they play in often demand a certain kind of 19th century style of music making. To see the effect a more contemporary building can have, you only have to look at Disney Hall in LA, where the building itself seems to have encouraged a much more modern outlook, where the creative impulses of the composer are once again back at the centre of orchestral life. LA Phil, who are based there, typically premiere over 20 new pieces a season. Don't worry, they do also play Beethoven. And these days composers are a much more diverse and friendly bunch than they once were. And yes, that finally includes a good and growing number of female composers. The inclusion of more composers of colour still has some way to go, but some small steps have been made in that direction in recent years. Putting the trust in all of these composers to take the orchestra forward in exciting new directions is, I think, the best way to secure its future.
Нет, я все-таки за то, что женщина это женщина, что она не мужчина все-таки. Не понимаешь. Не понимаешь. Я за действительность все-таки, да? Да мне наплевать, северянин ты или южанин. Как бы если она беременна, то она где угодно. То есть их функция количество детей, понимаешь? То есть род людской, если угодно. Да, то есть это их смысл жизни, понимаешь? Не понимаешь? Или бессмысленность. Да, бессмысленность. Доброта, потому что, да. Ну он понимает, он уже понял тебя почти, что да. Да. Ну да, понял. Да. То есть они мужчины, не надо их смотреть как на мужчин. Да, даже если они за всех сил их ударят. А это все несчастье и злоба просто, понимаешь? То есть поэтому они как бы, да, понимаю, да. Да, понимаю, это, который их погоняет теперь, да, понимаю. Поэтому это все, следовательно говоря, да, можно и лучше, я понимаю, да, сторона улучшения это всегда, ну, это без меня даже, да. Ну а что ты, блин? Я не смотрю на это нормально. Знаешь, как и нормально, и нормально. Если как ты мне прикажешь, что это самое? Да мне на это вообще насрать. Я не женщина, я за это отвечать не буду. И серьезно это смотреть я не собираюсь, да. Жизнь свою нормальную жизнь, свою, добрую свою нормальную. Вот да, ну вот этого к вопросу о том, что если женщина одинока. Ну да, понимаю, там, да. Ну, да. Да, понимаю. Да. Я тебе говорю, короче, версия такая, смотри, невидимая, то есть, если ты, да, то есть, как бы ты как вот, ну да, как типа святые там, да, ну, вот это как вот объяснишь, ну, не понимает она тебя. Если женщина одинокая, то она неряха, как бы, да, понимает она тебя, да, типа того, да, то есть, там безденежье, безвластие, неизвестность, да, то есть, да, ну, как бы раба, типа того, почти что, да, понимает она, да, как монахиня, монашенька, типа того, да, натурально, да, обед, да, я не думаю, что, а зачем тебе быть одинокой-то, да, понимаешь, скорее всего, просто злоба твоего характера, да, специфика небольшая, скажем, да. Ну да. Ну, пожалуйста, дело меня не касается. Искусственность это мужская или женская тема. Да, то есть, понимает она. Ладно. Ну, я понял. Зачем мне это? Так вот и все, блин. Понимаешь, никто не знает этого, смотри сам. Ну, все, понимаешь.
Кирилл Ивановский, один из ведущих IT-инженеров Роскосмоса, один из тех гениев, которые стоят за созданием мировых инновационных